This is Entre Ed Talk, the podcast for entrepreneurial educators by entrepreneurial educators. We are your hosts, Toy Hirschman and
Amber Ravenscroft. This podcast is created by the National Consortium for Entrepreneurship Education, or Entre Ed for short.
Hi, and welcome everybody to the Entre Ed Talk podcast. We are thrilled today to have our great friend and super entrepreneur, Joe Kapp. Joe Kapp has been a partner of ours for a very long time, and he, like I said, is a wonderful friend. We have known each other through many different partnerships. Joe is a serial entrepreneur and started and sold his first business in college. Since that time, he has started numerous other successful ventures and nonprofits. In 2016, Joe was appointed to the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Joe has over 10 years of experience working in the technology industry, having advised Fortune 500 companies on the use and implementation of new and emerging technologies. More recently, Joe has served as the entrepreneur in residence at Eastern Community and Technical College, working with farmers, growers, and coal-affected communities to increase entrepreneurship, capital investment, and economic diversity in Appalachia and economically challenged communities. Joe is also the co-founder of the LGBT Technology Partnership, a national nonpartisan organization advocating on behalf of LGBTQ+ communities and technology issues like privacy, security, and bullying. Joe founded the National Center for Resource Development to help mission-driven organizations and educational institutions increase their impact. Welcome, Joe.
Well, thank you. Thank you both for having me. A dynamic duo here. What a pleasure and honor it is to be here with you guys today.
Pleasure is all ours. So I guess we'll get started and ask you a couple questions. But first, can you tell us about yourself? What you were like, in your K through 12 upbringing. We have a lot of educators in our audience, and then higher ed, and how your entrepreneurial mindset really got started.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's probably important to note that I have a twin sister. So throughout my life, partnership, even before I was born, was a significant part of the types of activities that I was involved in and engaged in, because from a very, very early age, my twin sister and I were very close and continue to be very close. And so the idea of partnerships and collaboration started, I suppose, even before I was born. I think as a kid, I was not the best student and a bit rambunctious, ADHD. So for a lot of our educators out there, you'll probably recognize it's the type of student that does okay in class, does kind of okay, but really kind of looks at things from a little bit of a different perspective, a little bit more independent, and may not necessarily follow all the rules, but has creative energy and is super excited to get involved in learning, but learns in a little bit of a different way. And so I think that part of that experience in the way that we learn and how we teach students both about entrepreneurship and more broadly, and the way that we can do it in a much more tailored fashion is a super exciting innovation for education as we continue to move forward. So for me, the entrepreneurial mindset started even when I was really young, washing cars around the neighborhood and setting up a lemonade stand, those types of activities. So it's sort of always been a little bit of part and parcel for who I am.
I love that. You're like collaborative since the womb. That could be your motto.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm so glad you said that about ADHD and learning and being a little bit rambunctious, because a lot of times that's seen as an asset in entrepreneurship, but in schools, it's not seen as an asset. And we try to bring that kind of message when we talk about entrepreneurial mindsets to educators, because you need to meet kids where they are and recognize their strengths. And sometimes kids that ADHD or have different strengths, they go by the wayside in traditional education. So.
And I think there's a lot of opportunity to help those kids really identify a pathway that is going to be a little bit of a non-traditional career pathway. Certainly, it's been that way for me. I've done a lot of different things as a result of my inability to focus, but it's the opportunity to be able to cultivate that, particularly in communities where those kids maybe can really be additive to the economic diversity of the community. I think that there's really big opportunities there.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I love that you would describe yourself as rambunctious because, I mean, we know that, right? So you still are. Student Joe still is. But I think that's what makes you so great and so impactful because you're always kind of bouncing around in anything that you're passionate about, you run for. So I know you recently spoke at Kaufman eShip around your entrepreneurial journey, and we touched on it a little bit during our bio introduction, but maybe if you could quickly walk us through what your journey has looked like, because there's so many things that we didn't even have the opportunity to cover. So I don't know where you want to start.
Well, yeah, no, for sure. Like I said, my journey in entrepreneurship started when I was really young, putting together and gathering kids in the neighborhood to start a little car wash business because we wanted to be able to go to Disney World together as a Spanish club. And so I got all the other kids to work together and do fundraising for that. But then in college, I started a video production business and really got my hand at an entrepreneurship there. But at the same time, I was also coming out as gay, and it was a very different time. And I wanted to learn as much as possible about HIV and AIDS and became a Florida HIV/AIDS counselor. And so at 19, while many of my friends were, in college going out to parties and drinking and those sorts of things, I was counseling people on death and dying and seeing their lives, cut short. At the same time, I also saw some of the tragic circumstances of them getting kicked out of their home or getting fired from their job. And I vowed, as I saw that, to never be in that same situation of vulnerability. And also when you're 19 years old, that type of experience really changes you to make you realize that we're only here for a short period of time, and what you do and how you do it and how you comport yourself and how you have to take care of yourself became really, really important to me. And that was one of the biggest catalysts for me, was recognizing that as a gay man, I could get fired from my job, and that in many respects today, even as it stands, you still can get fired from your job merely for being LGBT. And so I swore to myself that I would never be put in a situation that I would be vulnerable, and I wanted to be able to have dominion over my time. And so in many respects, that has driven me personally to ensure financial independence and a pathway of entrepreneurship. It's also now driven from an advocacy perspective for me to advocate on behalf of entrepreneurs who maybe oftentimes don't have a voice or have been felt like they've been marginalized, to be able to serve as that voice to say, look, we have some barriers, some systemic barriers, some geographic barriers, some other demographic barriers, and how can we go ahead and remove those so that everybody has equal access to opportunity and equal access to resources that are available by our governments, whether it's state, local, or federal. And so in many respects, what's driven me has been a desire to go ahead and really open up the doors for entrepreneurship to as many people as possible so that they can find a pathway to personal financial independence in the same way that I have.
That's incredible. And it's so true because, people can't sometimes be what they can't see. And we talk all the time about showcasing different perspectives in entrepreneurship, because if you see yourself in somebody else, you're like, oh, okay, if that person can do it, then maybe I can too.
Yeah, I think, Toy, that's a really good point, and I think that it really runs the gamut. I don't care who you are. I've been fortunate because I've had the opportunity to be exposed and work with so many people, from farmers and growers and folks in Appalachian coal-affected communities to transgender communities in a number of different states. And, sometimes the issues are very different, and sometimes the issues are oftentimes very similar. And how can we as educators, remove some of those barriers and help students identify their highest and best opportunities to really to grow into. And there's some other aspects around entrepreneurship that I think are also important, but particularly for teachers, how can you go ahead and manifest that innovative mindset, that entrepreneurial mindset, to help students find not just a career pathway, but a way of living.
I'm so inspired. I'm just going to sit here for a little bit and
think about that for a minute.
Go brew a pot of tea.
So speaking of that, so how do you, as a little boy coming from Miami and then by way of DC and all of these different sort of city experiences, land yourself in Appalachia and deal with all of the differences between you and the people, the community that you're trying to serve? That had to be an interesting an interesting challenge.
Yeah, for sure. So after I sold my financial services business, my partner and I retired out to West Virginia, and I began working with a local community college there, Eastern West Virginia Community and Technical College. And, Toy, I think the important thing here is not necessarily to focus on the differences. I mean, people in rural communities are not all that different from people in cities. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all people. We may work differently. We may have different demographics, or the color of our skin, the way that the cars that we drive, or those sorts of things. But I think inherent in entrepreneurship is that it is certainly one thing that can bring us together, because that's part and parcel of the American dream, and it's part and parcel of I think the American experience. And so while there are differences and there's some challenges that rural communities have that are maybe unique from an entrepreneurial perspective, I think that the important piece is that in many respects, we're very similar. We want to be able to have a family that's safe and free from major challenges. We want to be able to provide for our families. We want to find work and opportunities that are purposeful and meaningful. And so, what I found in rural communities is that there's a lot of overlap between rural communities and urban centers, and people not just in urban and rural, but people across the world. In many respects, that desire, that need to sort of the aforementioned pieces or values of life and what contribute to a joyful and happy life, I think are really universal. So I don't like to look at it as urban versus rural and what the difference is. I think that entrepreneurship has a way and a means of bringing people together, especially when you keep in mind the end customer. So whether you're a farmer growing food for people or you're an innovative technology person thinking about who's going to utilize this various product or this food or this service, that's universal, and that doesn't discriminate in geography. What does discriminate, though, sometimes is that access to resources and the access to opportunities. And that's where I think that community colleges can come into play in a significant way. America's libraries can come into play. Our state, local, and federal governments can really open up the doors to expand access to those opportunities, to create greater equality of access and greater opportunities to really for exposure to those resources that are already existing. Does that make sense?
100%. Yeah, that's the access to resources is, I think, the biggest. I appreciate you bringing that up. And when you serve as an entrepreneur in residence at Eastern West Virginia Community and Technical College, that advocacy is definitely brought center stage. So I guess for our listeners, what does that mean? Like, what does an entrepreneur in residence mean? What does that involve? And why did you choose to take that route?
Well, the route chose me. I was coming out of a yoga.
You are an entrepreneur.
The route chose me. I was coming out of a yoga class, and I ran into the president. And I told the president I'd be interested in teaching entrepreneurship, and that was really my first, significant exposure to teaching. But I realized that our community colleges as an asset can really be leveraged in a much more significant way. And so how do we leverage the existing resources of our community colleges and help them understand the critical role that not just what they have been playing in terms of workforce development, but also this opportunity to really be a driver of a community developer and a manager and a coalescer, if that's a word, of resources in order to be able to provide for the community. And so as I got more involved in understanding the role of the community colleges and the fact that there's, over 1,000 of them, and they're only about an hour and a half from anywhere in the United States, I began to realize that there's this national network that focuses on workforce development and workforce training and technical skills. What if we were to apply the lens of entrepreneurship and help the schools become more impactful? So in addition to the relationship with Entre Ed, the joint relationship that we also have with the National Association for Community College Entrepreneurship to help really identify best practices and how those community colleges can become more impactful. And, under the leadership of Becky Corbin, that organization has really grown to become one of the largest entrepreneurial ecosystems across the United States. And so that journey in and of itself is a journey that really sort of chose me. But in part also based on my experience, my own personal experiencing and understanding my own challenges from an LGBT perspective, and how there were times in my life where I was not allowed to be at the table, or comments were made, or I would talk about my husband or my partner and people would walk away. And so I know intrinsically what it feels like to be marginalized and left out. And so that piece is a piece of part and parcel of who I am. And I carry that as a badge of honor to say, you know what, at the end of the day, there are other people who are experiencing it. Farmers and growers who maybe don't have access. And so how can we look at America's existing institutions and expand that openness so that more people have the opportunity for income equality?
I love that.
That's amazing. Joe, you touched on the word ecosystems, and I want you to expand on that a little bit, because that's such a big deal right now. And you're very involved in ecosystem building through your organization, Rural Rise, and through National Entrepreneurship Week. If you could maybe tell our audience what an entrepreneurial ecosystem is, and then how you're helping to build that and grow those resources in rural communities.
That concept of ecosystem is really founded in part, going back to the womb, and partnerships, the ability to be able to partner. The reality is that our societies become more complex, and we will never have all of the resources that we need, especially if we're starting a business from scratch. We won't have all of the resources that we need. And so that whole idea of partnering and creating extensive partnerships is significant. I didn't really understand the language of how that manifested in me until I started doing some work with NACI, and some of the work that Dr. Sarah Sarasvathy has done around this concept of effectuation, and how that effectuation mindset really talks about collaboration, and is a set of principles that she sort of discovered in working with interviewing a number of different entrepreneurs. And the reason why that piece is important is because one of the principles of effectuation is this idea of a crazy quilt. Because we don't have access to all of the resources, and because the work that I've done at Eastern West Virginia Community and Technical College, one of the smallest colleges across the United States, we knew that we didn't have the ability to go ahead and execute. And so the only way that we could go ahead and execute was partnering with as many people as possible. Both sort of traditional partners, but also non-traditional partners, and turning over every rock and leaf to say, hey, listen, here's what we're doing, and maybe this aligns with your own organization's mission. So the concept of this crazy quilt is really a manifestation of the ecosystem conversation of how can we bring partners, both expected and unexpected, to the table to help create alignment. And that alignment can be based on demographics, it can be based on location, and also can be based on industry verticals as well. There's power through those collaborations and identifying that. And one really good example is that as we continued out some of the work at Eastern, we began to collaborate with farmers and growers. But Eastern's a very small school, and we didn't have the capacity to hold large events. And so we began partnering very closely with the West Virginia National Guard and their armory, which had a huge drill hall for many of the cadets. And so we were able to partner with them to be able to hold a lot of our innovation and entrepreneurship events at the West Virginia National Guard. And that's been a great relationship. But if you had said to me starting out that you'd be working with the West Virginia National Guard around entrepreneurial, in some form or fashion, it's not anything that I would have said, oh yeah, of course, that totally makes sense. So when we talk about ecosystem, it's about bringing like-minded folks to the table to collaborate and to really begin, working in a direction that helps create greater openness and access to opportunities and resources.
You introduced me to Sarah's work and effectuation, and it has been impactful for me thinking moving forward, just because I think all of our organizations here represented today operate in that mindset that partnership is vital and valuable to creating new projects. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I do want you to touch base really quickly on the Rural Rise initiative and what that is and how you're kind of that's your baby. So how
it's one of them.
Well, yeah, you have like 20. You're very active.
One of the babies. The three of us rebirthed National Entrepreneurship Week, right? On one of the coldest days of the year, right? Remember we were sitting there, the three of us, and we're like, oh, we should do this together and relaunch National Entrepreneurship Week. So I just want to be clear, it's one of the many babies that I have jointly have had the opportunity to jointly launch. I mean, certainly, working in collaboration with Tina has been a great partnership and the ability to be able to do that. So I don't want to take credit for all the great partnerships. It's been a wonderful opportunity to be able to really work with amazing people. But Rural Rise, to kind of answer your question, Rural Rise came out of the understanding that within our rural communities, there were significant challenges that were just not being addressed. And as I got more involved in entrepreneurship and began to see some of the challenges that farmers and growers and folks in rural communities and coal-affected communities, there was a lack of understanding and appreciation on the left coast and the right coasts, on the coastal cities, to the challenges that many of our rural entrepreneurs face. And that kind of runs the gamut from a number of different things that many people may not think of. So for example, access to broadband, like something that many people just take for granted these days. In many rural communities, depending on where you are, you may not have access to that. The ability to go ahead and go online and start a business, like, for our Etsy business or sell something online. That's not an awareness that many people who are not in rural communities, or the fact that you might be driving through a rural community and, your cell phone just won't work for an hour because you're driving between mountains. People may experience that in a building in a urban setting, but, in rural communities, that's not an insignificant common experience. Transportation issues in rural communities are and can be issues and challenges. Utilities, access to clean water. Nathan Oley at the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, one of the great partners that I think we've all had the opportunity to be able to collaborate, really highlighted this for me. And when he told me, Joe, everything starts and ends with clean water. You don't have clean water, you don't have entrepreneurship, and you don't have a community. And so even the people who do the work around clean water, a lot of those are entrepreneurs and those types of people. I think the need for Rural Rise came about probably when I got started in the rural community and recognizing that there are some differences, and how can we go ahead and really work with rural communities and urban communities to create greater collaboration? And one place that, when you look at entrepreneurship, where that really can come together in a not insignificant way is around agriculture and our food. A lot of people don't necessarily think about it, but, for all of your listeners today, I imagine that at some point today, they're probably going to eat. And maybe they'll do it a couple times a day. And so the question is, well, where does that come from? Well, a lot of that comes from rural communities, right? And so the ability for us as Americans to be able to go ahead and create connection around food and our food system. So a lot of what we've been doing is working with farmers and growers to help them understand how can they access markets? How can they expand access? Maybe it's by ag tourism or ag technology. Because at the end of the day, a nation is only as good as the food that it provides the people. And it's certainly something that, in addition to entrepreneurship, our ability to go ahead and meet our farmers and understand where our food comes from. And that's an increasing trend that people really want to know where their food's coming from. And so, our rural communities, what became apparent was that there were some challenges, but the opportunities were also significant around agriculture and those types of things. So it's been really, really exciting. And it's been great to be able to partner with the Kauffman Foundation, with co-starters, with the Appalachian Regional Commission, AARP, Etsy, and a whole host of other organizations. Over 175 people came out last year. And this year, we're going to be doing it again in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, September 17th through the 19th. And so it's really, really exciting. And that particular Rural Rise event is really about entrepreneurial ecosystem development and ecosystem builders. And it's super exciting to be able to know that we're going to be bringing folks together for a second time to really address, how do we go ahead and improve opportunities and access for rural communities.
It's an amazing event. I was very honored to be able to come last year, and I hope I can get down there this year. It really was eye-opening, and the number of amazing organizations and people that attended and that were partnered, it was incredible to see that group of people come together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
One go that wants to go, you should go check out Rise. It really is special.
Yeah, thank you for that, Twy. I mean, we have the registration is limited only to 200 people. We hold it in rural communities because we want to support rural communities. So by virtue of that, it's a little bit limited in terms of size. But the goal is to really help spotlight and shine a light on the wonderful opportunities that exist within rural communities. So thank you for that.
Speaking of agricultural opportunities, I just want to talk because you had some national press around a very interesting biochar initiative. If you would walk us down that pathway a little bit, I know you love to share.
Well, again, I feel just immensely fortunate the opportunity to be able to collaborate with so many amazing people. And one of those people is a guy named Josh Fry, who came to us at Eastern and said, I've been working on this biochar thing. I'm kind of at my wit's end. I heard about the work that you're doing at Eastern with regards to entrepreneurship. And I'd like to really share my story with you. And Tina, who works with me and vice president of NCRD, we sat down and we listened to his story. And, as you might imagine, we get approached by a lot of people who have an array of ideas. And what began to surface was that as we dug into this, we began to realize that not only was Josh is, just by way of background, Josh is a chicken farmer, and he began working on this conversion of chicken manure, chicken poop, into this beneficial substance called biochar, which is essentially an ancient soil that has very specific properties, and specifically chicken poop biochar has very specific properties. And as we began to uncover the special properties, we began to realize that it could be used in a variety of different purposes as a soil amendment, almost like increasing the nutrient content, but also for remediation purposes to pull out heavy metals like lead and mercury, to resoil landmines. And at the same time, while you're going ahead and creating this, it has the ability to also create energy. And what essentially we learned was that in doing so, you're pulling a waste resource that oftentimes gets into our waterways and creates significant nutrient pollution issues. And you're really able to pull that out and change the nature of the way that it's being used. So after additional research at Eastern, we launched an event, brought together. We just said, look, we're going to do this biochar event. And we had a number of folks come to the table and said, hey, we're interested, and became aware of a whole ecosystem of folks who had been doing stuff in this area, in the Delmarva Peninsula region. And also began to understand that there was also national folks and international folks. And so now we launched the Eastern Biochar Initiative to really help drive biochar as a substance, as a way to really help stand up an industry from a commercialization perspective. So in a couple of weeks, Tina and I are going to be going to the National Biochar Conference in Denver, Colorado, and presenting there. And the nice thing is that, once again, from an ecosystem perspective, we're working with a whole host of great organizations, both within the region, but across the United States and even internationally, and a lot of four-year institutions, researchers, government agencies, state and local. And so it's been a phenomenal learning experience from my perspective. But if you had said to me when I was in kindergarten or when I started my video production company that I'd be working or mucking around in chicken poop after I got out of my financial services business, I certainly wouldn't have believed that. But what it is it represents a really, really good understanding and a really insightful and educational tool to say, you know what, communities can start with what they have. So look around. If there's waste products, how can those be leveraged? And how can we experiment and try things and fail and then try again? Thomas Edison did not go ahead and, create the light bulb the first time that he tried. Folklore says he's did it 1,000 times. Well, who knows how many times he actually did it, but it is instructive that we have to try a variety of different things. The ecosystem piece helps de-risk and remove some of the challenges and barriers and brings folks to the table to help drive it. And this is a really good example of how we might be able to stand up and commercialize an entire industry. And I really feel fortunate with the USBI, the US Biochar Initiative, and Tom Miles and Chuck Hedberg and a whole host of folks that have come to the table. Feel really fortunate. So we have a monthly call now, an ecosystem call that brings those folks to the table so that we can figure out how to drive that as to commercialization. Is really exciting.
This is such amazing stuff. I think we could have you on every month. And and we could just ask you for updates every month, and it would be that is so incredible. And who would have thought of chicken poop? And then there's a whole conference. I think that's so incredible. What a great, renewable, sustainable resource as well.
Absolutely.
So before we close out, I want to ask you one last question.
Sure.
We have educators that listen to the podcast, and hopefully we're getting more and more younger people listening also. But what advice would you give to a young person who's interested in entrepreneurship? And you kind of led into it a little bit there by talking about the having to fail and having to try and look around in your local area and see what's happening. But what advice would you give to young people interested in becoming entrepreneurs or just being entrepreneurial in general?
I think if there's one lesson that I have learned with the issues that I've faced over my life, and I think it's persistence, the ability to go ahead and if you have an idea or you have a vision for where you'd like to see the future be in your own future, don't let anybody derail you from that. It's easy. There's a lot of potential ways to get sidetracked, and there are a lot of obstacles that may be thrown at you that might try to derail that sense of direction. And I think that the best advice is you have to be persistent, you have to be gritty, you have to bob and weave and find alternative routes when people tell you no. People are going to tell you no. That's their job. And the job of the entrepreneur is to go ahead and really validate and say, is this an idea that's worth pursuing? And it's easy to get derailed, and it's easy to go ahead on a very individual day on day out basis. And so how can you as an individual entrepreneur pick yourself up and dust yourself off? So the one piece of actual advice that I would tell, my younger self, which I did, but I didn't do it till I got a little bit older, is to create almost like a scrapbook of that stuff that you have done, which reminds you of like the amazing stuff that you've done in your life, so that when you get kicked down, when you get punched in the face, when you get kicked in the teeth, you can open that book up and say, you know what? I've actually done some pretty amazing things. And what I'm hearing from other people who are angry at me or frustrated, or I'm not getting, in front of the people that I want to, it's a quick way to get back on your feet and pull up your bootstraps and get back into the game again, because it's going to happen. And the question is, how long do you take as an individual to get back into it? So, surround yourself by people who are going to go ahead and be supportive. You don't want yes people who are going to say, oh, that's the best idea ever. You want people who are going to be really candid with you, and people who are going to help lift you up. Because if you're an entrepreneur, sometimes it's a lonely path. Sometimes you are alone, and you have to find a way to get out of that mindset and back into the entrepreneurial mindset as quickly as possible.
Oh, I love that. I think I've said, oh, I love that 7 times on this podcast.
That's such a great idea, though, to make a scrapbook or some kind of reference that you can use to help keep you going. And I'm
just going to show you, like, I have mine right here, right? You can see, they have a little video. I have it. This isn't just like, oh, this is something that is an exercise in theory. It's got a lot of the things that I have done. And this is just a reminder of, like, when you get kicked in the teeth, and it's good to have it. It's good to have it in such a way. It's a physical manifestation and not just, something that's virtual, that you can go ahead and you can reach out and you say, you know what, this is something, man, I'm really proud of myself. Like, Amber, your degree, that you just finished, and how can you go ahead and add that and say, all right, I did some really cool stuff. And Toy, the amazing work that you did at the Discovery Channel, right? Like, that was awesome stuff. And how do you bring those? Here's the thing. Behavioral finance and behavioral economics teaches us, and this will be the last piece because I know that you guys want to go, but behavioral finance teaches us one thing, a number of things, but one of the most important things is that if you go ahead and compare somebody giving you a hug versus somebody going ahead and giving you a bruise, which lasts longer? The bruise. We are sort of evolutionarily inclined, designed to really harbor those negative things that happen in our lives and hold on to those longer. So an equivalent hug versus a bruise, the bruise is going to last longer. Our job as entrepreneurs is to go ahead and say, how do we go ahead and shift that back as quickly as possible so that we can get that sense of joy and being able to know that we're on a path of making change and doing the things that really allow us to live the life that we have imagined.
That's beautiful.
Okay, Toy, we have homework. We're going to go make our binders.
I know.
Next episode.
I'm looking at my bare binder right now that I need to.
We should just do a whole episode where we just share our binders to each other.
Yeah, and listen, I think it's the corollary to the vision board, right? So you have, I mean, a lot of people do vision boards, right? Like, this is where I want my life to be, and I think you can also do it's sort of a pick me up scrapbook of, hey, you know what? I've had a really bad day, or I've had a really bad week, or I didn't get this, or I got a grant proposal that was rejected. Okay, well, how do we pick ourselves up, and how do we do it? And there's a number of different ways. And I think surrounding yourself with people who really understand you and, don't allow you to wallow for too long and feel sorry for yourself, but also we have a responsibility ourselves as well to go ahead and really drive that to move to a place of really, really back to joyful thinking, as it were.
I love that. We've had so many good tangible advice pieces here lately in the last episodes. We're living for it.
Yeah.
My brain is now evil planning. Like, I'm thinking this could be an activity with kids.
Yeah, 100%. That's the same way I'm going with it.
Yeah, because I like to steal good people's good ideas whenever I can.
Active living, breathing thing. I mean, you can see some of the more recent stuff. So this goes back, and you're like, okay, well, look. When I was an HIV/AIDS counselor in college, and the work that got written up about that to even more recently, it's a great way to go ahead and have motivate and inspire yourself, because it has to come from within.
That's incredible.
Yeah, that's awesome. So how can, because we have to quit fangirling. I apologize for all our listeners. We think it's a great idea. We're really hype about it. But so how can people connect with you? Like, if I know your story is super compelling, so how can they connect with you? Like, what's the best way to reach you?
Sure. Probably the two best ways to reach us or to reach me is through Twitter. So at JCapp29. And also, if you're interested in the work that we do at the National, I don't have too much time to talk about that, but the National Center for Resource Development, you can go to Twitter as well, Resource Dev, or you can go online to resourcedev.org and see a lot more of our work. But we generally tend to be very, very focused on our work and probably don't do as good of a job as, touting all of it via social media as we probably should. So absolutely.
Thank you so much. This has been super insightful. And I mean, it's always awesome to chat with you. Luckily, we get to do that more often than just this podcast. So.
Well, I just feel fortunate and so grateful to work with such a host of passionate people. When I worked in the corporate world, it was a very different experience. I certainly worked with some amazing people in my corporate experience, but the level of passion that you ladies bring to the table and the host of organizations from across the United States that we have the opportunity to be able to co-create with and collaborate with to really help change America's entrepreneurial ecosystem across the board. When you think about it, entrepreneurship is not just something so that students can go ahead and build a business. And there's a very big national interest for us from a national security perspective, from an economic diversification nationally. And there's no shortage of good ideas, and there's no bias in terms of geography where those good ideas can come from. They can come from anywhere. And so the more that we can do and the more people that can be brought to bear, I think it helps people live healthier and happier lives.
Well said.
Well, thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Right. It was a pleasure having you here today, Joe. We appreciate you. All
right. Well, I appreciate you and the opportunity to collaborate with y'all.
All right. See you next week, folks.